200 Sambo students in the main hall of the CSKA Moscow Training Center laughed for exactly 8 seconds, the sound cutting through the air like a hot knife through butter. The tallest man in the facility, the reigning Soviet heavyweight Sambo champion, had just lifted a small Chinese tourist, who had been observing the training with curiosity, above his head, spun him around his axis, and thrown him onto the blue mats with a classic Russian suplex. The fall was high, it was fast, and it was technically humiliating. The tourist struck his back hard. 200 students began to laugh in unison, a laughter of mockery, of superiority, of those who took pleasure in seeing yet another overconfident foreigner receive the informal lesson that Soviet Sambo reserved for visitors who didn't know their place. But then, in the low bleachers on the east side of the hall, a military cameraman from the class of 41 recognized the face of the fallen tourist. He stood up from his chair, grabbed the arm of the comrade next to him, and whispered in Russian 4 words that would turn this morning into an oral legend of Soviet sports for the next 50 years. "It's Bruce Lee. It's Bruce Lee." The whisper turned into a buzz, the buzz into an announcement. The laughter stopped abruptly, and the Russian giant in the center of the mat, still with his arms raised in celebration of the throw, slowly lowered his hands, looked at the small Chinese man who was calmly rising from the floor, and for the first time in 11 years of his competitive career, felt his stomach tighten. It was October 23, 1972, 200 pairs of eyes. And in the next 5 seconds, the man who had the last laugh in that hall was about to realize that he had laughed in vain. The giant's name was Yuri Mikhailovich Bondarev. He was 31 years old. He was the reigning Soviet heavyweight Sambo champion with 3 consecutive titles in 1970, 1971, and 1972. He stood 205 cm tall and weighed 145 kg. He had been discovered at 15 in a small town near Sverdlovsk in the Urals by military coach Anatoly Kharlampiev, the man considered the founder of modern Soviet Sambo. Yuri was taken to Moscow at 16, trained intensely in the Red Army Sports Network, and became a professional at 19. At 22, he won his first national title. At 31, he was considered the most dangerous fighter in the Soviet Union in any hand-to-hand discipline. He had a nickname by which the entire Soviet Sambo community called him, the Bear. He earned the nickname at 23 in the 1964 USSR Championship final, when he threw a Georgian opponent with such force that the man flew off the mat, past the official zone, and crashed into a concrete wall 4 meters away. The Georgian was paralyzed from the waist down for 3 weeks. He partially recovered but never competed professionally again. The Bear wept that night in the locker room. It was the only time he ever cried because of the damage he caused on the mat. After that night, he stopped crying. The nickname stuck, and never left. In 11 years of his career, the Bear had 187 wins, 0 losses, and 0 draws. 162 of those victories ended with a knockout throw. The Bear was not an athlete. The Bear was a state asset of the Soviet Union. Bruce Lee was 32. He was in Moscow on an unusual 3-day stopover on his way from Rome to Hong Kong after completing post-production for The Way of the Dragon. The Soviet stop was not touristic. It was discreetly organized by a cultural diplomat, a friend of producer Raymond Chow, in response to a specific request from Bruce himself. He wanted to observe Sambo training inside the Soviet Union in person. He considered the discipline one of the most sophisticated grappling systems in the world, and intended to adapt Soviet techniques for his next films. He had studied old videos of Kharlampiev and read every translated manual he could find in Hong Kong. Now, he finally wanted to see with his own eyes how Sambo was taught in its institutional cradle. The cultural diplomat, a Russian named Igor Petrov, obtained permission for a 2-hour technical visit to the CSKA Moscow Training Center, considered the temple of Soviet sports. Bruce arrived on the morning of October 23 in a simple gray tracksuit and white sneakers, accompanied only by Petrov and a military translator. He was led into the main hall. The 200 students present were not warned who the foreign guest was. The head coach who met Bruce was Colonel Coach Pavel Voronin. Pavel spoke decent English. He led Bruce along the outer perimeter of the blue mats, explaining the structure of the Soviet Sambo curriculum, the stages of technical progression, and the division between sport Sambo and combat military Sambo. Bruce listened in respectful silence, memorizing and asking precise technical questions. Voronin was impressed by the depth of the visitor's prior knowledge. To any professional, it was obvious that this Chinese tourist had studied the discipline very seriously. It was at this moment that the bear, who was training in the center of the hall with two selected sparring partners, noticed the small group on the perimeter. He walked over, formally greeted Voronin in Russian, looked down at Bruce, and with a smile said something in Russian that the military translator did not immediately translate. Voronin insistently asked for the translation. The translator, clearly embarrassed, translated, "Mr. Bondarev asks if the tourist would like to feel Soviet Sambo on his own skin before leaving." Bruce smiled and formally asked for permission from Colonel Voronin. Voronin hesitated for 3 seconds. Bruce politely insisted, saying it would be an honor. Voronin agreed. Bruce stepped onto the blue mats and calmly took off his white sneakers. 200 students immediately stopped training to watch. In the center of CSKA Moscow, there was a silent rule. When the champion the bear conducted a technical demonstration, everyone stopped. Bruce stood in the center of the mat barefoot with the relaxed stance he usually used in his own academy in Los Angeles. The bear approached, gently grabbed Bruce by both lapels of his tracksuit as if he were going to explain a training movement, and said loudly in Russian, "I will show you the Russian greeting." The translator translated. Bruce nodded politely. Then the bear, in one continuous movement he had honed for 17 years to execute with maximum perfection, lowered his body, placed his right hip under Bruce's left hip, lifted the 64 kg Chinese man above his own 145 kg, made a full rotation around the axis of his left foot, and threw Bruce onto the mat with a technique known as Uchi Mata, adapted for Soviet Sambo. The fall was high, it was fast, and it was technically flawless. Bruce struck his back against the mat with the characteristic dull sound of a controlled impact, and 200 students began to laugh. The laughter spread in concentric waves. First, the bear's two sparring partners closer to the center of the mat laughed. Then, the veterans of the program sitting on the side bench laughed. Then, the younger students in the low bleachers laughed. Within 4 seconds, the entire hall was laughing. 200 Soviet voices simultaneously mocked the little Chinese tourist whom the national champion had thrown like a sack of potatoes. It was the traditional form with which Soviet Sambo welcomed visitors who dared to observe with an air of superiority. The bear raised his arms, walked around the mat, accepting the mocking applause of his comrades. He was about to step off the mat and return to training with his sparring partners when silence fell. Military cameraman Sergei Volkov from the class of 41, who had worked on documentaries about Asian cinema for the Army's cultural department, was the one who recognized the tourist's face. He stood up from the stands and whispered to his companion in disbelief in Russian, "It's Bruce Lee. It's Bruce Lee." The whisper spread among the 200 students in the hall over 11 full seconds. Those who knew who Bruce Lee was, and by 1972, many Soviet Sambo practitioners had already heard of him through bootleg tapes that circulated underground in Moscow, repeated the name to their neighbors with disbelief. The laughter stopped abruptly, as if it had been cut. The bear was still standing in the center of the mat with his arms raised when he noticed the silence descending upon the hall like a heavy curtain. He slowly lowered his hands, looked around in confusion, and looked at Bruce, who was slowly rising from the mat, methodically brushing off his tracksuit. For the first time in 11 years of his competitive career, he truly felt his stomach tighten. Bruce stood on his feet, looked at the bear, smiled slightly, and said in a calm voice in English, "Very good technique." He waited for the translator to translate. He waited for the bear to process it, and then added in the same calm voice, "Would you do it again?" The hall went even quieter. The bear hesitated for 2 seconds. The pride of a Soviet champion who had 187 wins and 0 losses in 11 years depended entirely on immediately accepting the challenge. He accepted and advanced toward Bruce with the same technical stance he had used 2 minutes ago. He extended his open palms toward the lapels of the gray tracksuit. The first second, the bear's palms closed on the fabric, but this time, as he squeezed, he realized that Bruce was no longer there. Bruce, at the exact moment the giant's fingers were closing, took a half step to the right, and the grip caught only empty air. The second, the bear instantly pivoted on his heel with a speed honed over 17 years trying to find Bruce on his left flank. But Bruce was already completely on the other side, in a low stance with his right hand firmly and accurately grabbing the giant's left heel. The third second, Bruce pulled. It was a simple leg trip without visible roughness, with pure precision tension applied exactly to the right biomechanical point. The bear's 145 kg instantly lost its point of support on his left leg. The giant fell on his back onto the blue mat, with the dull sound of a heavy impact, exactly in the same spot where, 3 minutes earlier, Bruce had fallen before the same 200 witnesses. The fourth second, Bruce did not let go of the heel and immediately applied a straight ankle lock, a Sambo technique with reverse lateral pressure. Executed at an ideal angle between his own right wrist and the giant's Achilles tendon. The bear felt the tendon slowly stretching to the very point of an inevitable rupture. He also felt, in that moment, that this technique was taken from the very Soviet Sambo he had just demonstrated as proof of superiority. The fifth second, Bruce did not push to the point of rupture. He held the move for exactly 2 seconds with the precise control necessary for the bear to fully realize he was under threat, and then he let go. He stood up and looked at the giant lying on the mat. In a quiet voice, audible only to the bear and the translator, he said in English, now we are even." He bowed in a formal, respectful bow. He stepped off the mat, put on his sneakers, apologized to Colonel Voronin for interrupting the training, and left the hall accompanied by Petrov. 200 students did not move for another 6 minutes. Yuri Bondarov was never the same fighter after that October 23, 1972. There was no serious physical injury, his ankle recovered in 3 weeks. But something inside him shut down on that mat in the presence of 200 witnesses who had just been laughing at him, laughing at another. At the 1973 USSR Championship, 4 months later, the bear lost for the first time in 11 years in the semifinals to a 28-year-old Lithuanian Sambo practitioner named Vytautas Kozlovskis, whom no one considered a serious threat. It wasn't a knockout, it was on points. The bear made 3 elementary technical mistakes that he had never made in official competitions. In 1974, he lost again in the quarterfinals. In 1975, at 34, he officially announced his retirement. He moved to a rural Dhaka 80 km from Moscow. He refused to give interviews for the rest of his life. In 1995, at 54, he gave a single statement to an American journalist specializing in the history of martial arts, who had been tracking this story for a decade. He said only this: "I trained for 17 years to believe that my size was the answer to all questions. Bruce Lee showed me in 5 seconds that my size was merely a question." He died in 2003 at 62 from heart complications. He was buried without military honors and without a sports ceremony, at his own request. Cameraman Sergei Volkov, the man who recognized Bruce's face that October morning, lived until 2011. In the final years of his life, he often told the few people who knew the truth about that day at CSKA that in that hall, he learned the only lesson that truly matters, that collective laughter is almost always the last sound one hears before an even greater humiliation occurs. That big men trust in their size until the very moment they discover that size was never the main thing, and that the silence that follows interrupted collective laughter is the deepest sound in the world, deeper than any scream, because it is the sound of 200 minds simultaneously realizing that they had just laughed at the wrong person. In those 5 seconds on October 23, 1972, 200 Soviet Sambo practitioners learned once and for all that the most dangerous person in any training hall in the world is never the biggest one. It is the one who enters silently, observes in silence, accepts the first throw without complaint, and waits only for someone in the stands to remember who he is.